Welcome to Summer Lens. I'm your host Eva. Last time we looked at the gatekeepers who stand between the prescription and the patient, PBMs. This time I want to look at the other side of that gate, the companies that build the drugs in the first place. We are looking at the pharmaceutical industry, but not just the science side. We are looking at the hidden realities, because making the drug is just the beginning. Let's go back to May 2019. Novartis gets FDA approval of a drug called Zolgensma. It is a one-time gene therapy for a disease called spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. If you're not familiar with SMA, it is a devastating genetic condition. Babies born with it are missing this crucial gene that produces a protein essential for motor neurons. Without it, their muscles simply waste away. They lose the ability to sit up, to swallow, and eventually to breathe. Without treatment, most of these kids don't even make it to their second birthday. But suddenly, there's a cure. It literally uses a viral vector to deliver a functional copy of the missing gene right into the children's cell. It replaces a broken code, and it saves these children's lives. But here's the catch. The price tag attached to that single intravenous infusion is over $2 million. Overnight, it becomes the highest priced drug in the history of the world, and what happened the very next day? Insurers denied the coverage. They were calling this FDA-approved gene therapy experimental, or they say it wasn't medically necessary. Prior authorizations dragged on for weeks, even turned into months. Parents were having to launch GoFundMe campaigns, literally begging strangers for money on the internet, all while they watched their children continue to irreversibly deteriorate in their curbs. The drug existed, the scientific miracle had been achieved, but access broken down entirely. And that brings us to the core thesis of our episode today. This rewrites how we think about healthcare, because FDA approval is not the finish line, it is just the midpoint. Getting the FDA to say yes is really only half the battle. So our mission today is to uncover the invisible commercial challenge that existed between the lab bench where a drug is invented and the patient waiting at the pharmacy counter, controlled by corporate gatekeepers who didn't invest a single penny in the research and development of the cure, but they hold absolute unchecked power over who really gets it, and this is something that affects every single person listening. So to you, our listener, whether you are just trying to pick up a generic prescription on Tuesday afternoon, or you're hoping a breakthrough miracle cure for a loved one, this invisible war is dictating your health and your wallet. Let's start with this massive misconception, the myth of the finished product. We have this idea that FDA banning the grabber and saying approved equals to immediate access, but the idea tells a very different story. When you look at commercial data tracking drug launches, it takes an average of 12 to 24 months for specialty drugs to even get included on a standard insurance formulary after FDA approval, 1 to 2 years. Why the massive delay? What is fascinating here is the complete disconnect between scientific reality and commercial reality, FDA scientific efficacy and safety. They look at thousands of pages of clinical trial data, they look at the molecule structure, the side effects, the manufacturing quality, and they ask one binary question: does this chemical do what it claims to do safely? But payers, the insurance companies and the PBMs who handle the prescription plans, they don't measure scientific wonder, they measure financial impact. They have one committee, the Pharmacy and Therapeutic Committee, the P&T committee says, is it cost effective compared to what we already pay for? They're building actuarial models, they're figuring out the budget impact for their specific patients, and most importantly, they're negotiating behind closed doors with the manufacturers. They have two entirely different languages. The FDA says this drug is medically necessary because it cures the diseases. Right, but the payer looks at their spreadsheet and says this drug is massive, unplanned liability to our quarterly budget, so the definition of medical necessity gets completely redefined by corporate budgeting. And even when a drug finally makes it onto the formulary, the barriers didn't just vanish. The sources show that roughly 30% of all FDA-approved drugs face prior authorization requirements in their first year. From the insurer side, it meant to stop doctors from overprescribing super expensive new drugs when a cheaper alternative might work. But operationally, it means the doctor has to submit this mountain of clinical paperwork to a third-party reviewer at the insurance company just to justify writing the prescription. It flips the dynamic. The doctor isn't just treating you anymore. They have to act as a defensive attorney, pleading your case to some claims adjuster who's never even met you. But an even more aggressive and more controversial tack is step therapy, the fail-first protocol. As mentioned in our last episode, step therapy is a protocol where the payers force patients to fail on older, cheaper alternative drugs first, before they will even consider paying for the new prescribed, more expensive drug. And this happens even if the new drug has vastly superior clinical data. Let's make it concrete. Imagine a patient is diagnosed with severe rheumatoid arthritis, painful joint condition. A new biologic drugs come out. The clinical trial shows it's incredibly effective, much faster acting, that halts joint destruction better than anything else on the market. So the doctor prescribes it, but the payer intercepts that prescription and says, no, first you have to take this older generic drug. We require you to take it for 6 months. If your joints continue to degrade, or if the side effects makes you voluntarily ill, then we will let you start up and try slightly more expensive older drug. And if that second drug fails, maybe after a year of irreversible joint damage and agonizing pain, we will finally authorize the new biologic your doctor wanted in the first place. Basically telling a patient, you must get worse before we let you get better. It is a financial algorithm applied to human biology, and it saves payer billions of dollars. A significant percentage of patients will either give up fighting the paperwork or switch insurance providers, or they just stay on the cheaper drug even if it's only marginally effective. And the craziest part is when the payer said no right out of the gate, even after the FDA has given the green light. And this is a well case study from just a few years ago. Biogen's Alzheimer's drug, aducanumab. The FDA approved it in June 2021. Now it was a highly controversial approval within the scientific committee. But the fact remains, the FDA officially gave it the stamp of approval. Biogen just got up for millions of patients. They were scaling up manufacturing, getting the sales force ready, anticipating billions in revenue. In April 2022, CMS a coverage memo for aducanumab, and they use a policy called coverage with evidence development. They say they would only cover the drug for patients enrolled in qualifying clinical trials, which mathematically is basically 0% of the general population. And since Medicare covers the mass majority of Alzheimer's patients in the US, commercial insurance just followed their lead. So the FDA said, yes, you can sell this, but the payer ecosystem fully refused to finance it, and the market just evaporated overnight. By 2024, Biogen basically threw in the towel and withdrew the drug entirely. It is like a company spending billions to build this revolutionary new space rocket, and it passed every governance safety inspection, but when they roll it out to the launchpad, the gatekeepers just changes the locks. To understand why this vital power held by the insurance companies and the middlemen is so devastating, you have to look at what it actually costs the pharmaceutical manufacturer to reach that starting gate. The upfront investment. When we talk about a drug company, people often imagine a giant pill factory. Some cheap chemicals in a van, pricing them into tablets over a weekend, and then marking up the prices by 10,000%. That is a mental model for tech or consumer goods, like engineering an iPhone. figure out the unit cost and ship it. But the manufacturing part of pharma is actually the most predictable part. A pharma company is really a risk management engine. It is an organization built entirely around absorbing catastrophic scientific failure. Let's look at the Tough Centers data. When a company finds a promising new molecule and finally put it into a human being for the first time, entering phase 1 clinical trials, that drug has a 90% probability of failing. After surviving years of animal models and computer simulations, 9 out of 10 will fail in the human trials, and phase 1 is just testing safety. You give it to healthy volunteers just to see how does the body metabolize it. Does it destroy the liver? Just moving from phase 1 to phase 2, the failure rate is 63%. So right out of the gate, they realize the body metabolizes it too fast or it is toxic, and the project is like millions of dollars gone. Then you get to phase 2. That's where you introduce the drug to a small group of actual patients with diseases. Now you're looking to see if it actually works, trying to find the right dose. From phase 2 to phase 3, 69% of drugs fail. The drug is safe, but it just doesn't cure the disease like it did in Petri dish. Biology is incredibly complex, which brings us to phase 3. If a drug survives the first 2 phases, the company commits to these massive international trials, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of patients, and they're designed to prove statistical superiority against a placebo or the current standard of care. At that point, you've already sunk hundreds of millions of dollars just to get to phase 3. But the toughest data shows that even at this final hurdle, from phase 3 to FDA approval, 48% of drugs still fail. It is basically a coin toss at the finish line. And for cancer drugs, oncology, it is even worse. Roughly 65% of cancer drugs that make it all the way to phase 3 will fail to get FDA approval. So when we look at the whole timeline, it takes an average of 10 to 15 years from discovery to a commercial product, and median capitalized cost to develop one approved drug is between 1 and 2.8 billion. And the keyword here is capitalized. The 2.8 billion isn't just what it costs to make the one successful medical. It simply includes the cost of capital and the cost of graveyard. When you buy a successful drug, you are retroactively paying for the 9 failures that paved the way for it. The story of Pfizer's Trastuzumab from 2006 perfectly illustrates this. Pfizer was developing this normal cholesterol medication. They were totally convinced it was going to revolutionize cardiovascular care, best-selling drug in history potential. The early data was so strong. They poured massive resources into it. We're talking about roughly 800 million into clinical program, and they get to this massive phase 3 trial with over 15,000 patients. They're literally at the 1-year line. And then the independent data monitoring committee takes a look at the unblinded trial results, and the data is just catastrophic. The drug wasn't preventing heart attacks. It was actually increasing blood pressure. The mortality rate for the people on the drug was significantly higher than the placebo group. It was literally killing people. So Pfizer had to halt the trial immediately. The molecule was dead. Almost $1 billion and a decade of science just vanished overnight. Zero future revenue. But the reason Pfizer didn't just collapse the next morning is because the other side of their portfolio. The exact same year, 2006, Pfizer's blockbuster drug, Lipitor, another cholesterol drug, generated roughly $13 billion in global revenue. And that is the portfolio economics models in a nutshell. Lipitor was the anchor. It generated the massive cash flow needed to absorb the $800 million credit left by the failure, and it funded the next batch of phase 1 trials. It is like a Hollywood studio. You finance a slate of 10 huge big-budget movies, 9 of them boom completely. The studio takes a total write-down, but the 10th movie is Avatar. And Avatar doesn't just have to be profitable, it has to make enough money to pay for all 9 flops, cover the studio's overhead, and refill the war chest to fund the next slate of 10 risky movies. However, one structural difference here, copyright versus patent law. If a studio makes Avatar, they own the rights to those characters forever. They can monetize that franchise for a century. But a pharmaceutical company operates on a ticking exclusivity clock, the patent cliff. Now, patents last 20 years, which sounds like a long time. However, they have to file that foundation patent very early in the R&D process. They usually file them when the drug is still a molecule being tested in animal models, years before human clinical trials even begin. They have to do this to protect the intellectual property before they start publishing the data. If they publish the science without a patent, someone else can steal it. So the clock starts ticking before the marathon even begins. By the time the drug survives the 10 to 15 years Continent, goes through phase 1, 2, and 3, and finally gets that FDA stamp of approval, a huge chunk of that 20-year patent has already burned away. The effective market exclusivity, the actual time they have to sell it without generic competition, is typically only 8 to 12 years. So they have a maximum of 12 years to earn back the $2.8 billion, cover all their failures, and make a profit. And when that window closes, the patent cliff is absolute. The day that exclusivity expires, the FDA allows generic manufacturers to enter the market, and the generic companies didn't absorb the cost of 9 failures. They just reverse engineered the successful molecule and compete entirely on manufacturing margins. They undercut the original price dramatically. The original manufacturer can, and often does, lose 80 to 90% of their revenue on that specific blockbuster drug almost overnight. Within 12 months, the golden goose is just gone. Now that we've established the brutal reality of the R&D factory, we have to look at the pricing logic. How do they mathematically decide what a new therapy should cost when they're staring down the 8 to 12 years window? From an economic standpoint, when you hold a monopoly on a life-saving product, you don't price it based on what it costs to make. They use value-based pricing models, trying to capture the willingness to pay of the healthcare system. The willingness to pay for a drug that stops a baby from dying is essentially infinite. It is inelastic demand. A patient cannot just choose to wait for a clearance sale. If you need to survive, you need it right now. So health economists try to quantify that value using metrics like quality adjusted life years, QALYs. They try to put a dollar figure on a year of perfect health. The manufacturer models the total economic value, providing hospital stays, eliminating surgeries, and sets a price that extracts as much of that value as the payer will tolerate before they start putting up these access roadblocks we talk about. And this logic reaches its absolute extreme when we look at the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. Because historically, pharma companies just completely ignore real diseases. The math just didn't work. If a disease only affects 5,000 people globally and it costs $2 billion to develop a cure like Zolgensma, or 1,000 patients with inherited blindness like a drug called Luchama, which was priced at $150,000, you simply cannot charge a few $100 a dose. The per patient price mathematically must be astronomical, or the company would go bankrupt making it. This is the cold hard math of rare diseases. The fixed cost of R&D, the scientists, the labs, the FDA trials is roughly the same whether the resulting drug treats 10 million people with high blood pressure or 10 people with ultra-rare genetic mutation. It was a total market failure. Therefore, the Orphan Drug Act comes in and it offers massive incentives, tax credits, with FDA fees, extended market exclusivity, all to rule capital back into rare disease research. And it was incredibly successful at driving innovation. But it also cemented a harsh economic reality. If the R&D cost is a fixed billion-dollar sunk cost, but your patient pool is tiny, the price per patient has to skyrocket. Like Zolgensma, it treats roughly 400 infants a year in the US. You divide the billion-dollar development cost by like 400 patients over a 10-year exclusivity window, and boom, this is how you get a 2.1 million list price. And this isn't just a new segment anymore. The industry has aggressively pivoted towards these complex target therapies. The data shows that specialty drugs now accounted for roughly 50% of all US prescription drug spending, half of the entire national pharmaceutical budget, even though these specialty therapies makes up less than 2% of total prescription volume. This is an insane concentration of capital. 2% of the prescription volume up 50% of the cash. Let's look at a case study where this economic logic voluntarily collides with massive public outrage. Let's talk about Sovaldi. This is from 2014. Gilead Sciences launched Sovaldi, which was a cure for Hep C. And that is important, a cure, not a treatment. Cure the virus in 12 weeks. But Gilead priced it at $84,000 for the course of treatment, which broken down to about $1,000 a single pill. There was a massive, highly publicized Senate investigation. People were accusing Gilead of pure greed. And yet, from Gilead's perspective, and from the perspective of their health economists, the pricing was entirely economically rational. Let's look at the alternative. Before Sovaldi exists, a Hep C patient would suffer for years, slowly progressing to advanced liver failure. They would need years of expensive hospitalization, toxic inferium treatments that feel like chemotherapy, and eventually many would need a liver transplant. The lifetime cost of the healthcare system for managing a single patient's liver failure was as easily $500,000, not to mention the immense human suffering. So Gilead comes along and say, look at the math. We will replace $500,000 of pull-on medical care and the liver transplant with a simple 12-week cure for $84,000. We are saving the system over $400,000 per patient. Rational for a spreadsheet, but for a state medical director, the state Medicaid programs cover a massive proportion of Hep C populations. If you're running the budget for a state, you don't have $84,000 per patient lying around in cash. If you have 10,000 Hep C patients in your state and a cure arrives, everyone wants it immediately. But the lifetime savings of avoiding a liver transplant 20 years from now don't help a state budget that is legally required to balance this year. The money isn't there today. The state directors had to choose between funding the Hep C cure or funding public schools and fixing roads. The immediate sticker shock broke state budget, and this tension brings up perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire pricing puzzle, the global dynamic. Because a US Medicaid program might be struggling with an $84,000 price tag, but someone in France isn't paying for that. And this is what economics refer to as the global free rider problem. The data is incredibly clear on this point. The United States pays roughly 2 to 4 times more for the exact same patent drugs compared to Europe, Canada, or Japan. Why? The reason is entirely structural. Almost every other developed nation has a centralized government-run healthcare system with strict legal price controls. Let's take the UK for example. They have a board called NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. They calculate something called a QALY, a quality adjusted life year. They quantify the value of a year of health. They look at a new drug, they run the math on how many good years of life it adds, and then they simply tell the pharmaceutical company, we evaluate the clinical benefit of this drug at X dollars, take it or leave it. And the pharma companies just have to accept it. They say, if you want to sell your drug to the 69 million people in the UK, this is the price. And because it is a take it or leave it offer for the entire country's population, the pharmaceutical company almost always takes it, even at a massive low profit margin, just to get the volume and the revenue. But the US system doesn't do that. We don't have a single negotiator. Our system is hyper-fragmented. We have thousands of different commercial insurance plans, employers, and pharmacy benefit managers all negotiating separately. So the pharmaceutical industry looks at the landscape and argues that because those foreign countries refuse to pay prices that reflect the true $2.8 billion cost of R&D, the US consumer is essentially subsidizing global medical innovation. So the US is fitting the bill for the world. The industry's argument is basically, if the US implements strict European-style price controls tomorrow, the revenue for those global industry would collapse. They argue that 90% failure rate we talk about would suddenly become financially impossible to sustain. We wouldn't be able to pay for the flops. The R&D pipeline for Alzheimer's, for cancer, for rare diseases would just dry up. But the critics of the industry pointed out a different, equally valid reality. They argue that the United States shouldn't have to bear this burden alone, effectively acting as the world's medical charity. The critics look at the human reality on the ground. US patients declining in bankruptcy over medical debt, diabetics rationing, life-saving insulin, and ending up in comas, with seniors skipping doses of heart medication because they simply can't afford the out-of-pocket costs at the pharmacy counter. The critics argue the current pricing model, while maybe mathematically necessary to fund the current R&D ecosystem, is simultaneously driving the US healthcare system toward total insolvency. This is a part of the reason most favored nation came out, but to truly understand the system, we have to hold both of these realities in our heads at the same time. The R&D really does cost balance, the failure rate is real, the US market does point the mass majority of the profit that funds the next generation of cures. But it's also objectively true that this exact same system crushed vulnerable US patients. Both things are happening at this exact same time. But wait, here's where the story takes a massive turn. Because even if we accept everything we just talked about, even if we accept the higher sticker price, even if we say, okay, the $2.8 billion cost is real, the 90% failure rate is real, the ticking 10-year exclusivity window is real, so the price simply has to be high, it gets run. Because the pharmaceutical company that invented the drug doesn't actually get to keep that sticker price. And this is the darkest, most hidden part of the whole system. We are moving into the invisible toll road. This is where we have to explain the concept of gross to net, because without it, nothing about modern drug pricing makes sense. Whenever you see a terrifying headline on the news about the price of a drug, new cancer pill costs $15,000 a month, you're almost always looking at the list price, the sticker price. In industry, this is called the WAC, the wholesale acquisition cost. This is the sticker price on the window of the car at the dealership. But this is not the amount of money that a pharmaceutical company actually deposits in their bank account. What they keep is called the net price. And the gap between the list price and the net price is what is called the gross to net bubble. It is a massive bubble. According to data from the Drug Channels Institute and SSR Health, for top-selling drugs, 40 to 60% of that list prices go to rebates, administrative fees, and discounts paid to middlemen, pharmacy benefit managers, wholesalers, and specialty pharmacies. If a drug maker wants its new pill on formulary, they have to negotiate with the PBM. If you're not on the formulary, no patient with that insurance can get your drug. You're locked out of the market. And the PBMs demand a massive tool for access on that formulary. The tool comes in the form of retrospective payment called a rebate. So if the PBM demands a 50% cut, the drug manufacturer has a huge mathematical problem. They have to protect their bottom line, their net price, to pay off that R&D debt and satisfy their shareholder. They have no choice but to artificially inflate the sticker price high enough so that after they pay the 50% toll to the middleman, they still have enough net revenue left over. And this inherent tension between value, list price, and system budget really reached a boiling point with Silverload. It was a brutal coalition between long-term clinical value and short-term budget constraints. The pricing was economically rational, but mathematically and politically impossible for the payers to absorb all at once, which moved us to the actual mechanics of the supply chain. Between Gilead's warehouse and the patient lives is a vast, heavily fortified apparatus. The channel. The channel is where the theoretical economics of pricing meet the brutal reality of market access. And the gatekeepers here are the PBMs. Decades ago, PBMs were just simple administrative entities. Employers hired them to process claims and mail out pharmacy cards. But over time, through massive consolidation, they morphed into some of the most powerful entities in the entire healthcare system. Today, 3 massive PBMs control roughly 80% of the prescription volume in the US. They manage drug benefits for huge health insurers, Medicare Part D plans, and Fortune 500 employers. And their primary weapon is that exclusionary formulary we talked about earlier. If one of the big 3 PBMs decides to exclude your drug from their national formulary, you don't just lose a few customers, you instantly lose access to 40, 50, maybe 60 million covered lives. Your market share just vanishes. A drug maker convinced a PBM to grant them access to those patients by offering rebates, and the Hep C saga provides a definitive case study of PBM power. Between 2014 and 2016, we saw that industry insiders called the Hep C rebate war. Gilead has Sovaldi, and they quickly follow up with an even better version called Havalone. Clinically, these were the gold standards. But shortly after, AbbVie, a major competitor, gets FDA approval for their own Hep C regime called Vicirapag. Vicirapag was effective, but the clinical consensus generally viewed it as slightly inferior. It required taking multiple pills a day instead of one, and it carried some additional liver-related contraindication. Express Scripts, which was one of the largest PBMs in the country at the time, approached AbbVie and brokered a massive unprecedented agreement. Express Scripts offered to make Vicirapag the exclusive Hep C drug covered on their national formulary. In exchange, AbbVie provided a massive confidential rebate rumored to be aggressively high, effectively slashing the net cost of the drug for the PBM's clients. Express Scripts removed Gilead ones from the formulary entirely. If a patient was covered by the Express Scripts plan and their doctor wrote a script for Harmony because they believe it was the safest option, the PBM simply rejected the claim. They told the doctor and the patient, "We only pay for AbbVie." Gilead eventually had to capitulate and offer massive rebates of their own just to buy their way back onto other formularies. The medical decision was entirely subordinated to the financial leverage of the channel. This is a toll road analogy building a state-of-the-art automobile. A pharma company spends 10 years and billions of dollars engineering this incredible car. They crash test it, the government approves it. It is the safest vehicle on the market. But the car manufacturer doesn't want asphalt, the PBM on the toll road, and they stand at the on-ramp and tell the car company, "We don't care how safe your car is, pay us a 50% toll on every vehicle, or we drop the barricade and your car doesn't get on the highway." You either pay the toll or watch millions of patients get diverted onto the older, bumpier roads. But let's expand this analog because the toll is the only extraction point. Let's look at the insulin market. The historical data on Eli Lilly's Humalog perfectly demonstrates how this toll road inherently drives up the sticker price. The insulin market is perhaps the most tragic manifestation of the gross-to-net bubble. Between 2001 and 2019, the list price of a vial of Humalog surged by a 270%. All remember the headlines. Patients rationing insulin, ending up at diabetic ketone acid doses, people dying because a 100-year-old biological hormone suddenly costs thousands of dollars a month. It was viewed as the ultimate example of pharmaceutical greed, and the public outrage was entirely justified. But the underlying mechanism was largely misunderstood, because while Eli Lilly raised the list price by 270%, their net revenue per vial, the actual dollars they kept after paying rebates to PBMs, only increased by roughly 30% over that same 2-decade period. The rest of the margin was continually absorbed by the PBM toll road. As PBMs consolidated and gained market power, they demanded larger and larger rebates to keep Humalog on preferred formulary tier. Because there are few major insulin makers, Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Sanofi. The PBM could threaten to exclude Humalog entirely and switch millions of diabetics to a competitor's insulin if Lilly didn't increase the rebate percentage. So Eli Lilly was trapped to generate the larger dollar amount required for the rebate without destroying their own net profit margins. They simply cranked up the list price. This inflation was a mechanism to fund the PBM's demand, but as we established earlier, the uninsured diabetic working up to the pharmacy counter had to pay that inflated list price. They were collateral damage in a corporate rebate war, and the extraction mechanics are becoming even more sophisticated today. We have to look at the 2024 FTC interim report on PBMs. The FTC highlighted a massive shift towards something called specialty pharmacy steering. PBMs don't just own the highway anymore, they now own the only gas stations on the highway. The major PBMs have vertically integrated. They now own massive specialty mail-order pharmacies. They are the facilities designed to handle the complex logistics of specialty drugs like cold storage and complex dosing protocols. The FTC report details how PBMs are increasingly redesigning benefit plans to steer patients exclusively to their wholly owned specialty pharmacies. And once a PBM has forced the volume through their own pharmacy, they begin charging the drug manufacturer undisclosed, highly opaque fees. Things called data management fees, distribution fees, inventory fees. So the manufacturer is paying a rebate to get on the formulary and then paying a separate set of fees just for the privilege of having the PBM's pharmacy put the drug in a place and ship it. And according to the FTC, the PBMs are also marking up the cost of drugs on the back end when they're billing the health plan sponsors. They are extracting a toll from the manufacturer, a fee from the distribution, and a markup from the employer. It is a masterclass in value extraction, which leads us to a profound realization of the state of the industry today. When you synthesize the catastrophic risk of the R&D model we saw in Actor 2 with extraordinary leverage of the channel we just dissected, you arrive at the pharmacy paradox. The industry currently occupies four conflicting realities simultaneously. We can break it down into four pillars. Pillar 1, they are scientifically essential. We only have to look back to the rapid development and scaling of the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines or the CAR-T therapies that are functionally curing specific blood cancers. They have created over 800 orphan drugs since the 1983 Act. Academic labs, major universities are brilliant at discovering foundational biology, but they don't have the balanced risk capital required to run global phase 3 trials, and they don't have the specialized knowledge to scale up manufacturing. Without the pharmaceutical industry, the translation from a whiteboard theory to a vial in a clinic still stalls. They are the only entity capable of building the rocket. And then we hit Pillar 2. They are politically despised. Polling routinely ranks the pharmaceutical industry at or near the absolute bottom of public trust, often scoring lower than the federal government or the oil and the gas industry. They are the universal volume of the U.S. health narrative, subject to constant, highly publicized congressional hearings where executives are interrogated over pricing practices. But that brings us to Pillar 3. They are financially powerful. Despite the 90% failure rate, when they do succeed, the financial returns are huge. The industry constantly enjoys net profit margins in the 15% to 20% range. They have massive scale. They generate blockbuster revenues that rival the GDP of small nations. Merck's flagship immuno-oncology drug Keytruda generated roughly $32 billion in revenue in the year 2025 alone. They have immense balance sheets, and yet we arrive at Pillar 4. They are commercially constricted. This is the core of the paradox. Despite their scientific brilliance and massive wealth, they are functionally dependent on the PBMs, the payers, and fragmented distribution system that dictates access and demands 40 to 60% of their list price in concessions. They make the conscious choice to price a gene therapy at $2 million, and they choose to raise the list price of a biologic by 10% every year, but they are also stuck on a rebate treadmill that was entirely engineered by the channel gatekeepers. It is too simplistic to frame this just a greedy farmer versus a heroic patients, or heroic innovators versus bureaucratic middlemen. The structure of the market itself actively demands and rewards this behavior from all participants. It is an ecosystem defined by misaligned incentives, and this systematic friction is precisely what prompted recent government intervention. We have to look at the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, the IRA. This is a monumental shift in the regulatory landscape. For the first time in history, the IRA grants the federal government the authority to directly negotiate the price of certain high-spend drugs under Medicare. Because for years, Medicare Part D, which covers prescriptions for seniors, was legally barred from negotiating drug prices. They just had to accept it what the market dictated. But the IRA changes that. It targets older drugs that have been on the market for a significant period, typically 9 to 13 years post-approval, but haven't yet faced generic or biosimilar competition. like the massive blood thinner Alcos or the diabetes drug Jardiance. The government is financially stepping in to force prices down. What does that actually look like in practice? In practice, CMS selects a list of the drugs that cost Medicare the most money. They sit down with the manufacturer and they essentially dictate a maximum fair price. If the manufacturer refuses to accept that price, they are hitting with a massive tax, or they have to pull all their drug out of Medicare or the Medicaid entirely, which is financial suicide. The government is finally using its massive purchasing power to cap the payout, which fundamentally alters the exclusivity countdown clock we discussed earlier. From a purely commercial standpoint, it introduced a new constraint. The 8 to 12-year window of unincubated monopoly pricing is now under threat of federal intervention at the tail end. Their response is grounded right in the portfolio economics model. They argue that these constitute an innovation penalty. They warn that if the government aggressively cut the profit margins on their most successful blockbuster drugs, the industry will have less free cash flow to reinvest into the high-risk phase 1 trials for unproven therapies, particularly in complex fields like neurology or early-stage oncology. The Hollywood studio argues that if you cap the ticket price on Avatar, they can't afford to fund independent art house films. This is the economic argument they make. Conversely, proponents of the law emphasize the immediate necessity of providing financial relief to Medicare beneficiaries who are being crushed by out-of-pocket cuts, trying to curb the historical practice of continuous price hikes on older medications, regardless of the political framework you apply to it. The IRA structurally compresses the window in which companies must recoup their R&D investment, which brings us to the final consideration of this episode. If invention is truly only half the battle, and the entire system from the PBM toll road to the new government price ceilings is optimized for revenue extraction and budget management rather than seamlessly patient access, how does breakthrough science actually reach a patient today? It requires manufacturers to engineer commercial adaptations that are just as complex as their molecular biology. We're witnessing what we might call the access paradox. The United States possesses the fastest, most accommodating regulatory approval apparatus in the world, with programs like priority review and breakthrough therapy designations. The FDA can approve a highly innovative drug in roughly 10 months. This is fast compared to the centralized system like the European Medicines Agency. So the scientists get the green light faster than anywhere else on Earth, but because of the fragmented, highly adversary payer channel, the actual formulary adoption, the time it takes from payer to agree to cover the drug, is far slower and vastly more uneven than in a single payer system. We sprint through the scientific gate only to stomach a massive bureaucratic traffic jam at the insurance gate. So how do companies clean the jam? We can return to our opening case study of Zolgensma. When the payer is balked at the $2 million upfront cost, Novartis didn't just walk away. They had to invent entirely new financial architectures to circumvent the budget constraints. They pioneered outcome-based contracts. Novartis structured agreements with insurers where they tied the payment to the real-world clinical performance of the drug. If they fail to achieve specific quantifiable function milestones within a designated timeframe, Novartis agreed to refund a proportion of the cost to the payer. They de-risk the clinical uncertainty for the insurance company. It is an incredibly creative solution, but it also highlights the desperation required to penetrate the channel. They also had to offer amortized 5-year installment payment plans. The pharmaceutical companies essentially had to act as a commercial bank. leading the drug to the state Medicaid program so the state's annualized budget wouldn't shatter in a single year. Furthermore, modern pharmaceutical companies now invest billions in internal market access teams. They employ armies of health economists, actuaries, and negotiators whose sole purpose is to battle the PBMs. And they deploy massive patient assistance programs like the copay cards you see advertised on television. So let's talk about the copay cards, because that perfectly encapsulated the absurdity of this system. The manufacturer sets a high list price, the PBM demands a high deductible or co-insurance from the patient to surpass utilization. So the manufacturer issues a coupon directly to the patient to bypass the high deductible that was created by the very channel the manufacturer is paying rebates to. It is a closed loop of systematic inefficiency. The manufacturer spends billions to circumvent the barriers irritated by the middlemen they are totally relying upon. So for you, the listener, the ultimate takeaway from this episode is that your reality in the healthcare system is dictated by closed-out corporate mechanics. Your access to a life-saving therapy depends just as much on your specific employee benefit design, what tier of PBM design you drug to, and the secret rebate negotiations occurring between executive as it does on the underlying biologic science of the molecule itself. Science proposes, but the channel disproposes. Let's pull all these threads together. We've seen that the core business model of the pharmaceutical industry is absorbing the reality that 90% of scientific bets fail. When they do achieve a breakthrough, they utilize a rapidly shrinking window of patent exclusivity to establish monopoly prices, attempting to recoup billions in sunk capital and fund the next generation of risk. But that scientific achievement merely gets them to the starting line of the commercial market. Between the molecule and the patient sits a heavily fortified, highly consolidated toll road. Formularies, PBMs, and vertically integrated specialty pharmacies exert immense leverage to extract value through rebates and fees, which inflates the gross to net bubbles, distorts the true cost of care, and frequently leaves the most vulnerable patients stranded at the pharmacy counter. The rocket is built, the safety checks are passed, and the launchpad is guarded by a code booth. The FDA approval isn't the finish line, it is just the starting gate for the brutal, invisible marathon. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final forward-looking question to mull over. Something that builds directly on the mechanics we just dissected. We are about to see this system tested like never before. We've spent a lot of time today discussing drugs for rare diseases, like SMA or specific target oncology populations, small pool of patients. But consider this scenario. What happens when this incredible, fragile, heavily tooled, budget-constrained system collides with a drug that absolutely everyone wants, but no one knows how to finance? A true mass market chronic care breakthrough. Imagine a therapy that effectively treats obesity, actively prevents the onset of type 2 diabetes, and significantly reduces the risk of major cardiovascular events. And it costs, say, $1,000 a month list price. You are not dealing with 400 infants anymore. You are dealing with 100 million US adults demanding access. The manufacturing supply chains are physically constricted, and the insurance gatekeepers, the state Medicaid directors, are staring at the actuarial apocalypse. It will completely stress test the PBM rebate models, the employer benefit designs, and every single pricing assumption we just laid out. The GLP-1 revolution is here. Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound. It is unfolding right now. It is about to break the channel wide open. We'll dive into the GLP-1 market next time. Invention is not enough. Thank you for joining me on this episode into the reality of the pharmaceutical supply chain. See you next time.